Now, in this presentation, we are going to continue to discuss the phenomenon of synaptic plasticity in order to speak in a nutshell about what this phenomenon is about. Suppose this is a presynaptic neuron. This is the synaptic gap between the two neurons, and this is the postsynaptic neuron. The strengthening of the synaptic connection between these two neurons and or the weakening of the synaptic connection between the neurons both fall under the umbrella of synaptic plasticity. Now, synaptic plasticity has very far-reaching implications, and that would be the main topic of discussion in the current presentation. Now, let us look at the concept of uh, synaptic inhibition and synaptic facilitation in this scenario. Suppose there is a setup in which there is a presynaptic neuron which is capable of stimulating a postsynaptic neuron. So the presynaptic neuron causes a stimulation of the excitatory postsynaptic potential at the postsynaptic. However, there is another second neuron, which is neuron M1, which exerts an inhibitory influence on this presynaptic neuron. So, in the absence of M1 intervention, the firing of the presynaptic neuron leads to the firing of a EPSC in the postsynaptic neuron. However, when M1 gets involved, the inhibitory neuron, then the firing of presynaptic neuron does not lead to excitatory postsynaptic potential at the postsynaptic. So, why should this take place? This can take place via a mechanism by which the M1 actually, what it does is it inhibits the rise in calcium ion concentration by inhibition of the calcium channels in the presynaptic neuron. And we know that calcium ion Ca+2 ion is important for the fusion of the vesicle, presynaptic vesicle, and the release of neurotransmitter in this synaptic cleft. So, when calcium ion concentration increase is inhibited, the vesicle fusion does not happen and no release of neurotransmitter happens. And this is the reason why we do not observe a excitatory postsynaptic current at the postsynaptic neuron. Now let us look into the other possibility where M2, there is another neuron which is excitatory neuron, which the presynaptic neuron is capable of exciting the postsynaptic neuron, and M2 is a neuron which synapses with the presynaptic neuron, which is capable of further stimulating the presynaptic neuron. What happens in such a case? So, and how is that possible? Because M2 by a certain mechanism increases the possibility of increase in the calcium ion concentration in the presynaptic neuron. This encourages the neurotransmitter vesicles to fuse with the presynaptic membrane and release the neurotransmitter to the synaptic cleft. So in this mechanism, what happens is if the M2 is not activated, then we get a presynaptic neuron and the increase. However, if the M2 is activated, it so stimulates the presynaptic neuron that there is a further increase or potentiation of the postsynaptic neuron. That is, there is a further increase in excitatory postsynaptic potential in the postsynaptic neuron due to the involvement of M2, which we see this amplitude increase, which is seen in this graph here. Now, let us turn to the different possibilities again, which which we have already discussed in our neurotransmitter and the previous 3 lectures regarding synaptic plasticity. The different possibilities which become a reality when we look at the brain, the synaptic connections in the brain. So these synaptic connections can be axosomatic or axodendritic synapses, and in each of these cases, they can be either excitatory synapse or an inhibitory synapse. The synaptic responses can be mediated both by ionotropic receptor, which is present in the postsynaptic membrane, or G protein coupled metabotropic receptor, which is present in the postsynaptic membrane. The presynaptic cells can be modified through presynaptic inhibition or presynaptic facilitation. Now, taking all these possibilities into consideration, imagine when one neuron receives input from not one but thousands of other neurons. This gives rise and into this gives rise to a huge complexity of neuronal network. Now, inside this complexity, introduce the possibility of synaptic plasticity. So synaptic plasticity using all these three mechanisms can entirely reformat or reconfigure neuronal circuits. So this huge capability which is handed over to this phenomenon of synaptic plasticity, which forms the basis of learning and education throughout a lifetime. For example, the human brain, although the learning ability is very high during this critical period, but a human being learns and can acquire new education information throughout a lifetime. So this is possible due to synaptic plasticity, which endures throughout the lifetime of an organism. Not only that, it provides a security against neurological damages, which can happen due to traumatic brain injury, which can happen due to a brain stroke, or due to neurodegenerative diseases. So, synaptic plasticity, as we will be discussing shortly, provides us hope of recovery in such a situation. And also, it forms the basis of healthy aging of a human being. Now, one of the examples which can be used in this perspective is musical training. So, what has been done in this experiment is that there has been a cross-sectional study which has been performed in comparing the brains of musicians and non-musicians, and in these studies they have used the data which has been obtained from fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging, or EEG, which is electroencephalography. So using these techniques, what has been observed is in a musician's brain, there is increase in gray matter in all the lobes, that is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, as well as the occipital lobe. The gray matter corresponds to the number of cell bodies which is present in these regions, that is the number of neurons. And also concurrently, the increase in white matter, which is contributed by the myelinated axons of these neurons, which ensures extensive connectivity amongst or in between different regions of the brain. So in a musician's brain, all this, the gray matter as well as the white matter, is increased compared to a non-musician's brain. So this tells us the power of synaptic plasticity. Now, coming to the question of rehabilitation. Now, as we just mentioned, that a brain injury can happen due to a traumatic event, due to a stroke, which introduces a clog in one of these blood vessels, which was supplying blood to a particular brain region, or due to neurodegenerative disease. So, the affected region uh, loses its function, and this causes sensory motor disorder. So what the process of rehabilitation does is it aims to facilitate the recovery of this impaired sensory motor function via the process of new learning of the remaining brain tissues. So as soon as the concept of learning comes, along with it comes the concept of synaptic plasticity, which is brain's ability to strengthen or weaken connections between neurons, which we have discussed so far, and it plays a crucial role in rehabilitation in allowing the brain to adapt and reorganize itself, and it enables the individual to regain the skills it has lost due to these traumatic events. Now, in order to have a schematic representation of what is happening here, suppose neuron A fires to neuron C, and there is a coordination between these two firings, and neuron B communicates with neuron D. Now, suppose due to a particular brain lesion, this neuron B gets damaged. So, neuron D does not have an input from neuron B any longer. So, what comes to the rescue? The clinical recovery is associated with increased excitability of this neuron A, which now unmasks a latent synaptic connection via the process of plasticity, that is LTP, and thereby it not only connects to C but also connects to D. So this leads to the recovery of function which is observed. So how does rehabilitation, that is from starting from a trauma, how do rehabilitation and uh, training lead to recovery of function? Now, all these require synaptic plasticity, neuroplasticity. Now, neuroplasticity can lead to, if one can harvest this property of neuroplasticity during the neural rehabilitation process, it can lead to structural changes in the neuronal circuits, which can be due to growth of new synapses, synaptogenesis, elimination of existing ones, synaptic pruning, and changes in the strength of the synaptic connections. It can also involve other changes such as remodeling of the dendritic processes, axonal sprouting, neurogenesis, that is the birth of new neurons, the change in the myelination of the axon of the existing neurons, and entire reorganization of the cortical map. There can be also functional reorganization, which can be induced due to synaptic plasticity, which can involve changes in activation pattern of the neuron and the recruitment of additional brain regions which has the power to compensate for the lost or impaired function. So within this umbrella of functional reorganizations, there can be other changes which can act as compensatory mechanism. There can be task-specific reorganization, which can be induced by the process of therapy. There can be cross-modal plasticity, experience-dependent reorganization, and time-dependent changes. Now, what about use-dependent plasticity? Now, when a particular neural pathway is repeatedly activated, as we have seen in our previous discussion, uh, this leads to the synaptic connections within this pathway to be modified, and there can be increase in connectivity between the neurons, that is the strengthening of connection by long-term potentiation, or decrease in connectivity via long-term depression. Now, there can be other processes which lead to improvement in the process of neuro rehabilitation via learning of skill acquisition, rehabilitation, and motor learning, and constraint-induced movement therapy, which is very unique in the fact that the use of the unaffected limb, which is constrained. Suppose one limb has been paralyzed. Now, the unaffected limb is purposefully constrained, thereby forcing the individual to rely on and intensively use the impaired limb. And slowly, the function of the impaired limb is restored, and this happens at the level of synaptic plasticity. One can also introduce a human being into a more cognitively enriched environment, which can restore some of his lost function, which has been lost due to injury. This is also true for treatment of neurobiological disorders. Now, in experience-independent plasticity, when the neurons are again repeatedly and consistently activated in response to particular experience stimulus, the connections between these neurons are strengthened, and this leads to learning and memory due to the formation of new synapses and changes in synaptic strength or the reorganization of the neural circuitry. And sensory experiences play a very important role in experience-dependent plasticity. So one can see that all these approaches, which are basically dependent on synaptic plasticity, can contribute towards neurorehabilitation. Now, this is a work which has been recently published, which investigates the contribution of physical activity as well as it integrates artificial intelligence on neuroplasticity and cognitive rehabilitation in which happens in due to damage in neurodegenerative disorder. Now, what they aim to do is, using all these procedures, they aim to increase synaptic connectivity and neurogenesis and improve neuroplasticity. So both these approaches which is being targeted is dependent on synaptic plasticity. Now, enhancing brain plasticity via surgical means has also been tried. For example, this arm has been paralyzed due to a brain stroke. Now, there are surgeries which can be performed in which this brain region is connected to this paralyzed arm, and the remodeling of this brain region helps this arm to regain its previous function. So, surgical methods can also be used in order to harvest the possibility of synaptic plasticity. Not only that, synaptic plasticity is also believed to play a role in cognitive behavioral therapy. What is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy? It is a structured, goal-oriented talk therapy that helps individuals manage their mental health condition, emotional concerns, and even non-psychological health issues. So it is believed that cognitive behavioral talk therapy is actually working via synaptic plasticity. And this leads to long-lasting changes in the thoughts, feelings, and behavior of the individual after the therapy is completed. So we are all very hardwired, and much of our characteristics is determined genetically from the genes we have inherited from our parents. However, according to Alvaro Pascal Leon, the dynamically changing neural networks, which is possible due to synaptic plasticity, is evolution's invention to enable our nervous system to escape the restrictions which is imposed by its own genome. So, synaptic plasticity is actually a beacon of hope. It is a beacon of hope of learning, having new experiences, and storage of new memories throughout a lifetime. It is a beacon of hope that in the case of a a bad incident, for example, a neuronal injury which happens due to a stroke, there is possibility of rehabilitation, and this possibility is basically dependent upon this phenomenon of synaptic plasticity.